This is a troubling gospel story because as you first read it, if you caught all that, you would be forgiven if you think that Jesus is being downright rude to this woman, that he's treating her badly, that even he insults her. But of course, you and I know something about Jesus. We know where his heart is. I mean, would he really refuse a woman's request to heal her daughter? And so even as you begin the story, you realize that, oh, Jesus is going to heal this woman. And we know that Jesus isn't rude and insulting to people. And so just good Bible study means that what we have to do is we've got to dig into this thing a little deeper and see if we can figure out what's really going on. And is there a lesson in it for us? The part that maybe most of you don't know is the geography of this. They are in Galilee. That's where Jesus has been doing the vast majority of his ministry, and that's in the northern part of Israel. And now Jesus has taken the disciples, and they have gone farther north into this region of Tyre and Sidon. It is outside of the country of Israel. Jesus has taken the disciples into Gentile land. And you have to understand that matters to the disciples. In that day and age, there was a very big black and white distinction between Jews and Gentiles. Jews, as the disciples would have been taught from the time they were old enough to understand anything, the Jews were the chosen people of God. And everybody else was not chosen by God. They were Gentiles. And this was a very black and white distinction. It showed up in all sorts of different ways. You would have not intentionally, not without good reason, done what Jesus just did, leave Israel. You would have stayed in your homeland. And indeed, there was some traditions that when you came back, if you had to leave, when you came back, when you got to the border, you would pause and you would take your sandals and you would knock the dust off of them, because you did not want even the dust of Gentile land clinging to you. You would not eat with a Gentile unless there was some extraordinary reason to do so. You would only talk to them, have business dealings with them, again, if you had to. But otherwise, it was, we are Jews and we are the chosen people of God. And everybody else, well, they're everybody else. And so if you understand that, if I've conveyed that to you at all well, you'll get to the point where you understand the disciples, they're suddenly in Gentile territory. They don't know why, and they're probably really nervous about this. And then it doesn't help that some woman, a Gentile woman, starts calling out to them and, wanting this help from Jesus. And you can just picture, at least it's easy for me to picture, the disciples just kind of like, oh, please, no, send this woman away. And that's what they tell Jesus. Just send her away. We are not dealing with those people. That's what they want done. And then notice what Jesus does, what he says to them. He said, now this is to the disciples. He speaks to the disciples. He says this line, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I happen to think that line is not in Jesus' head, if you will. I think what Jesus is saying to them is what's in the disciples' minds. They're in Gentile territory. They don't want to be there. And they're caught up in this black and white distinction. And they would send her away. And I think Jesus turns to them and says, oh yeah, I know what you're thinking, right? Yeah, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. We're not supposed to be here, and you certainly don't want me to help her. I think Jesus is just articulating for them what's in their head. And then the woman comes up, makes her request, very polite, does homage to him. And then there again, I think what Jesus does in that moment is tell the disciples what they're thinking, because she needs help. Her daughter needs healing. And I think Jesus looks at her, probably with love, and then turns to the disciples and says, oh yeah, right, it's not good to give the food intended for the children to the dogs. In other words, he's articulating for the disciples, you think that I should send her away because you think that I should only be dealing with Jewish people. You don't think this woman is worthy of my help. And then, of course, Jesus heals her, which is what we would expect. It was, I think, a terrific lesson for the disciples. They didn't quite get it all the way, but if you know something of the early church, you'll know that the early church really struggled with this, because the question came up, is it possible for Gentiles to become Christian without first becoming Jews? That was the issue. In other words, did God open up salvation to everyone? The church figured out that the answer to that was yes. That's why most of us are here. But it was a difficult thing. And this, I think, is where Jesus lays the groundwork for that. So what's it got to do with us, though? Well, it's not too hard for you and I to think of things in our society, our culture, that are presented to us as black and white. You know, social justice issues, if you will, life issues, those kind of things are often presented to us that, we have a particular view, and of course we often think we are morally right in those views, and then there's those other people. Or for some people, it is just your voter registration card. Some people think that, well, I have this on my voter registration card, and those people have that other thing on theirs. And even within the church, there are people that will, suggest that, well, there's a difference, of course, between Catholics and non-Catholics. You're either a Catholic or you're not. Or within our Protestant brothers and sisters, certain denominations look at other denominations and go like, they're not one of us. So much of it is just presented to us as black and white. Black and white. Now, here's the thing you have to understand. In this story, this woman is a Gentile. I mean, that's a fact. That is a demonstrable fact. The disciples, Jesus, they're Jewish. This woman is a Gentile. That's true. And as you and I open up newspapers and news feeds, those distinctions that I just mentioned, for examples, they're all facts. It's true that you are not registered the same way as somebody else is, that you have a different view about an issue than someone else does. It is true. There are Catholics and there are people who consider themselves Christian and they're not Catholic. That's all facts. The question is, what do you do with those facts? And this is where I think it's really interesting to look at Jesus and what he does here. He doesn't seem to think that those facts are more important than loving this woman. The woman has a need. Her daughter is sick. And as far as Jesus is concerned, and I know this by his actions, that trumps everything else. I need to help this woman. This daughter is sick. They are both children of God, regardless of where they were born and what their beliefs are. They are children of God. They deserve my love and my attention. And is that not what Jesus told us? You have heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies. Jesus said at one point, hey, if you only love your friends, what credit is that to you? Everyone does that. But if you love your enemies, and this is Jesus showing us a very tangible example of how to do that. It's not that he gets involved. He's not suggesting that, the woman is right or wrong about her beliefs or anything like that. He's simply in that moment saying, the most important thing is I need to love you. And I just think that's something you and I need to consider. Sure, we open up the newspaper, we open up our feeds. There are some stuff that's quite troubling to us. They're all factually true. But the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because if we turn it into hate, if we become what the disciples were becoming, that they get themselves in a position and you start thinking things like the disciples were thinking, oh no, God's only for us. God doesn't, we're not going to extend God's love to other people. God's only for us. We start thinking insultingly of people who are not part of our little group, then we've missed it. We're not doing what the good Lord has asked us to do. You need to know that this is not an easy thing to pull off, especially in our culture, because if you are like most people, I can't imagine that you're watching any source of news that is teaching you how to handle things the way Jesus is handling them. If you're turning on news and news feeds and things like that, they're teaching you to be disciples, what the disciples were. Black and white, black and white, black and white. So you and I have to put all sorts of extra effort into trying to figure out, okay, all right, I disagree on this issue. Maybe a moral issue. Maybe I'm morally right on this issue. Okay, fine, but that still doesn't alleviate the responsibility for me to figure out how in the world am I going to love this group or this other person. I'm not going to get a lot of help out of society, but perhaps our Bibles can help us, perhaps our faith can help us. We need to work at it. That's what Jesus wants us to do. He wants us to be in Gentile territory, and he wants us to treat the Gentiles as they are children of God. That's what he did. That's what we can do. It is not going to be easy, and there are going to be people, they're going to think that we're not even doing the right thing by it. They're going to think we are helping the enemy or something like that. But we need to do what the Lord calls us to do. Just encourage you to give it some thought. It'll be hard, but it is definitely the right thing to do.